Hello, dear history enthusiasts and valued listeners of the History and Sleep channel. Tonight, we are once again guests in the magical atmosphere of history with a unique story that will both make you think and soothe your soul. Get ready, because this time, we will journey to a mysterious period in the dusty pages of history where science and reason were overshadowed and superstitions reigned, to the strange war that a pope declared on cats. This is not just the story of an edict. It is also a striking adventure that delves into the depths of medieval Europe, revealing how beliefs, fears, and unexpected consequences set off a chain of catastrophe. First of all, as always, we are curious to know where you are joining this interesting historical journey from. Share it with us in the comments. Perhaps you are listening to us from a quiet street in a historic city, or from a peaceful corner away from the noise of the modern world. Dear friends of history, the story you will listen to tonight whispers to us not only what a single edict can lead to, but also how terrible the consequences of ignorance, superstitions, and misguided interventions against nature can be. While intrigues in the Ottoman palace once determined the fate of a prince, this time, a strange decision made in the heart of Europe would affect the lives of millions of people and pave the way for a great epidemic that would deeply shake the continent's history. So, how did our innocent, furry friends fall victim to the Pope's wrath? Which superstitions, which fears triggered this absurd war? Tonight, moving through the tranquil pages of history, we will convey the truths behind this strange event to you in a calm and clear language. Close your eyes and surrender yourself to the flow of history. Because this is not just a story. It is also a thought-provoking adventure full of profound lessons from history that will soothe your soul. Imagine an era where the sun couldn't meet the earth. Hazy mornings were awakened by church bells, and people were made to fear the devil more than God. The only truth a child heard the moment they opened their eyes was that the devil was lying in wait, and that disease, famine, and every lightning bolt from the sky were the price of a sin. To be born in medieval Europe was to agree to live in hell while hoping for heaven. And in such a time, even cats were guilty. During this period, people saw the earth as God's testing ground, and the church as his representative on earth. The papacy was the master not only of religion but also of politics, the economy, and even the daily life of the individual. The voice of a priest ascending the pulpit every Sunday resonated more in the minds of the people than that of kings. Because a king's sword could cut a mortal body, but the church could brand the soul. And that is why every street, every house wall, every pore of Europe was kneaded with the breath of the church. Education was provided solely by the church. Books were expensive. The printing press had not yet been invented. Therefore, knowledge was limited and mostly in Latin. This meant that the people only knew what the church taught them. Fields rising from parched lands, Bibles bought with donations, people crying in the dimness of confessionals. At the center of all this life was a power both sacred and terrible, the definition of sin. In this age, God's wrath was spoken of more than his love. Natural disasters, plague epidemics, famines, and child deaths were all reflections of divine punishment on earth. And humans could be the target of this punishment at any moment if they did not repent. To keep this fear alive, the church told legends, erected statues, and adorned walls with frescoes depicting hell. Hell was not just a place reached after death, it was a form of fear. It was felt while alive. The social structure was woven with this mentality. There were sharp distinctions between nobles, the clergy, peasants, and slaves. The class you were born into followed you almost to your gravestone. Those at the bottom of society were deprived not only physically but also spiritually. Because they were deprived of knowledge, education, even the prayers of absolution that offered hope of salvation. Meanwhile, the rich believed they could lighten their sins by sending gifts to popes or donating land to monasteries. In villages, daily life began with the plow and ended with the bell. Women were mostly condemned to silence. Witch hunts had slowly begun, and the understanding that anything different was a potential threat had spread. A woman who was too familiar with nature, worked with plants, or interpreted dreams could easily be considered someone collaborating with the devil. Animals also received their share of this perspective, especially black ones, because darkness was the symbol of the devil, and a black cat, walking silently at night, with eyes reflecting light, could be seen as a supernatural being. And it was precisely here that the fate of cats began to take shape, because they lived especially alongside solitary women, because they could find their way in the dark, gaze like humans, and sometimes disappear inexplicably. These traits were excessive in a society like medieval Europe, which constantly blurred the lines between the supernatural and the mundane. An entity that was not understood was dangerous, and what was dangerous had to be either avoided or destroyed. The church fueled this understanding. Cats were portrayed as guides of dark entities, the devil's watchmen on earth, companions of witches, especially the black ones. A priest addressing his congregation from the pulpit would say, "If you see a black creature wandering around your house at night, it is the devil." People were afraid, because fear was a stronger binder than faith, and society began to unite around this fear. Cats were captured, burned, stoned, drowned, cleansed, or purified. No one questioned it, because the church had said so. Because sin could be not only what was committed but also what was condoned. Someone who pitted a cat was considered to have empathized with the devil, and this was a crime that shut the gates of heaven wide open. In this climate of social decay, the individual was not alone, but neither were they free. Society found its existence within the boundaries drawn by the church, and these boundaries came not from God but from the pens of those who spoke in God's name. Knowledge was scarce. Questioning was dangerous, and being different, whether in thought, appearance, or in friendship with cats, was the shortest path to hell. It was in this very atmosphere that one day, a pope declared that the devil had a hand in disrupting the order on earth, and that the devil roamed the earth through cats. This statement would nearly wipe out an entire species from the stage of history. Everything began in those times when ignorance thrived not in darkness but in a dim light. Because twilight is the place where you cannot fully distinguish what is right from what is wrong. In medieval Europe, people lived not by knowledge, but by rumor, not by evidence, but by intuition, not by observation, but by hearsay. And the most effective guiding force in this world was not reason, but fear. Fear, however, was wielded by the church like a pickaxe. Knowledge was not excavated, it was deepened as if digging a grave. Every superstition nailed the coffin of another belief. The church rose with the sound of these hammers. According to the church, human nature was inherently sinful, and a sinful soul could find salvation only through prayer, penance, and obedience. But the foundation of this obedience was not logic, but submission. And the best way to ensure submission was to suppress the individual's faculty of thought. Because a thinking person questions, and a person who questions cannot be controlled. That is why the greatest miracle of the Middle Ages was the declaration of thought as a sin. During this period, the church became the master not only of souls but also of imagination. People had even begun to fill with fear when looking at the stars at night. Because the stars were God's eyes, thunder was his anger. Rain was an answered prayer, But hail was a warning. Winds were angels, storms a curse, and there were thousands of rumors circulating among all these symbols. These rumors, over time, turned into superstitions. These beliefs took hold in the minds of the people as firmly as knowledge, even stronger than it. Because while knowledge was inaccessible, rumor was whispered in the ear. When a priest told a peasant, "If a blue light appears outside the village at night, it means demons are roaming there," that information became far more convincing than any book. Among these rumors, fed by the church's teachings, the ones that grew the most were related to the fear of the unseen. Women walking in the dark at night, old people talking to animals in their homes, village midwives trying to cure illnesses with herbs. All these were abnormal, and everything abnormal was a potential threat. The church equated this threat with the devil. It was said that the devil walked among us. So what was the devil like? Invisible to the eye, but it left traces. And those who bore these traces were the ones who behaved supernaturally. Superstition seeped in precisely through this gap. Silent and insidious, like smoke. Every illness was the price of a sin. If schizophrenia had been known, perhaps it would have been called by that name. But in that era, these people were considered possessed by jinn. A young girl having an epileptic seizure would immediately be taken to the church. Holy water would be sprinkled on her, prayers would be read, and if she resisted, she would be chained. Because resistance was proof of the devil inside her, and the people would watch this. Fearfully, but believingly. Because such rituals also eased their own consciences. The fears within themselves were externalized through these victims. Superstition was not just misinformation, it was a collective psychological release. Another widespread superstition concerned animals, especially cats, crows, and owls. These were suspicious because they could move silently at night, gaze like humans, or make strange sounds. The church took the myths about these animals and linked them to the devil. If a cat was watching you, it was a demon spying on you. Or if it cried out on the roof of a hut towards dawn, it was a harbinger of death. Such legends spread rapidly, because the people were closer to hearing than to learning. While minds were shaped by superstitions, the church, instead of suppressing these beliefs, began to control and direct them. When the plague broke out in a village, the cause could be shown as an unclean patch of land or a barn forgotten by God. Thus, the people were guided, able to direct their anger towards a person or a living creature. And these targets were often cats, and especially black cats, because their nature was incomprehensible. And what was incomprehensible was either sacred or cursed. The church exploited this public sentiment. The eyes looking down from the pulpits sometimes called the cat the devil's animal directly. Even in some documents, the expression, "Cats roam among us disguised as the devil," appeared. This mobilized the people, because people were already looking for an enemy. Life was hard. Hunger, disease, war, there had to be someone responsible for so much hardship. Sin alone was not enough. The guilty party needed a tangible form. Cats assumed this form. The animal of sorcerers, the helper of witches, the shadow of the devil. In this atmosphere, superstitions reached a point where people were subjected to trial by ordeal, being thrown into water. Women were thrown into water with their hands tied. If they sank, they were innocent. If they floated, they were considered witches. Because God would make the guilty float. In such a logical framework, the violence shown towards cats knew no bounds. Cats burned in the middle of the streets, thrown into wells, displayed in front of monasteries. All were sacrificed for the sake of a belief. But that belief was a product of ignorance more than God. Superstitions were like a weapon complementing the church's teachings. They were like an unofficial but pervasive, unwritten but binding book of rules. And these beliefs harmed not only animals but also people. Because anyone who was different could one day become the target of superstition. And one day, a cat with its large eyes sat at the center of those targets. And thus, the papacy would proceed to formalize this collective hatred. It was a morning when the sky had turned gray. One of Rome's ancient stone streets seemed to be preparing for an ancient rite. As the sun rose slowly behind the Vatican walls, the bells of St. Peter's Basilica echoed. This sound announced not only the beginning of a ritual but also the birth of a name that would lead to one of the darkest ideas of the Middle Ages. That day, the new leader of the Church ascended the throne, Pope Gregory IX. His name would later be remembered not only for his papacy but also for a decision he made regarding cats. But at that moment, no one was aware of it. Pope Gregory IX, born Ugolino Conti, was a member of a noble Italian family. He was aristocratic. He was educated and had risen meticulously through the church hierarchy over many years. He was intelligent but also stern, disciplined, and a leader who believed in the sanctity of obedience. First a cardinal, then known as an architect of the religious order among jurists and clergy. For him, faith was not just an internal experience, but a tool that shaped society, governed it, and when necessary, brought it into line through fear. By Gregory's time, Europe was experiencing fragmentation not only spiritually but also politically. There was a long-standing power struggle between the Holy Roman Empire and the papacy. The Church did not want to remain in the shadow of political kings. It was trying to consolidate its role as God's representative on earth not only as a spiritual but also as a worldly authority. Gregory was one of the most ardent defenders of this understanding. During his papacy, the papacy became not only a religious authority but also a center of political power. However, under his leadership, the greatest threat facing the Catholic Church was not kings but ideas. And these ideas were spreading silently among the people. Not peasants who didn't know Latin, but intellectuals who had access to books had begun to question. The name given to these schools of thought was heresy. Gregory saw the fight against heresy as a command from God, and one of his most effective steps in this direction was the establishment of the Inquisition. The Inquisition was the event that would associate Pope Gregory IX's name with one of the harshest phases of history. These courts would judge not only thoughts but also nature, and everything within nature would now be measured by intent. The direction of the wind, what a woman wore, what a child dreamed at night, or even an animal's behavior could be questioned and even cursed. This period was an era of interpreting God's wrath through the signs of nature. It was in this very climate that a rumor reaching Pope Gregory IX would change the course of history. A German cleric, known as a heretic, named Conrad of Marburg, wrote a mysterious and chilling letter to the Pope. This letter claimed that some people worshipped the devil, held nocturnal rites, and in these rites, swore allegiance to the devil by kissing black cats. This letter seemed like mere gossip in the hazy atmosphere of the Middle Ages. But for Gregory, it was enough. Because he took spiritual threats seriously. Even an ordinary animal like a cat could be associated with the devil. Because for a pope, suspecting everything dark was not suspicion but responsibility. Gregory not only read this letter but turned it into an edict. The document he called Vox in Rama declared black cats to be the embodiment of the devil. Now, the presence of a black cat was not just an animal but a spiritual danger. This decision targeted not only cats but also the subconscious of the people. Suddenly, in every village, every town, every household, a fear of black cats began. Mothers warned their children. Men stoned cats they saw around their houses. Women avoided neighbors who lived with cats. And all this had started with the signature of a man at a table in the Vatican. Pope Gregory IX's personality had compelled him to make this decision. He was the Pope of order. He found the way to silence chaos and destroying every threat in God's name. And in that era, even nature was not considered outside God's absolute dominion. Black cats were no longer just animals, but the very shadow of the devil on earth. Because Gregory had decreed it. Today, this decision may seem strange or even comical, but in the Middle Ages, a papal decree was not just an opinion, it was the difference between life and death. The war declared on black cats was a result of this understanding. Gregory IX's decree was not just words. It was the formalization of a kind of fear, and thus began one of history's most unjust wars. A man spoke in God's name, and thousands of innocent creatures perished in the echo of that voice. There are moments in history when a single piece of parchment costs thousands of lives. A single signature turns into a fear carried from generation to generation, and a single edict remains like a black stain on the mind of not just an era, but an entire civilization. One of those moments was inscribed into the Vatican archives by the trembling hands of scribes. The year was 1233. It was a spring day when the chill had not yet fully lifted. One of Rome's ancient stone streets seemed to be preparing for an ancient rite. As the sun rose slowly behind the Vatican walls, the bells of St. Peter's Basilica echoed. This sound announced not only the beginning of a ritual, but also the birth of a name that would lead to one of the darkest ideas of the Middle Ages. That day, the new leader of the Church ascended the throne, Pope Gregory IX. His name would later be remembered not only for his papacy but also for a decision he made regarding cats. But at that moment, no one was aware of it. Pope Gregory IX, whose original name was Ugolino dei Conti di Segni, was a member of a noble Italian family. He was aristocratic. He was educated and had meticulously risen through the church hierarchy over many years. He was intelligent but also a stern, disciplined leader who believed in the sanctity of obedience. First a cardinal, he later became known as an architect of religious order among jurists and clergy. For him, faith was not merely an internal experience. It was a tool that shaped society, governed it, and when necessary, brought it into line through fear. By the time of Gregory's papacy, Europe was experiencing fragmentation not only spiritually but also politically. There was a long-standing power struggle between the Holy Roman Empire and the papacy. The Church did not want to remain in the shadow of political kings. It was trying to consolidate its role as God's representative on earth, as a worldly authority, not just a spiritual one. Gregory was one of the most ardent defenders of this understanding. During his papacy, the papacy became not only a religious authority but also a center of political power. However, under his leadership, the greatest threat to the Catholic Church was not kings, but ideas, and these ideas were spreading silently among the people. It was not peasants, who didn't know the Latin prayers, but intellectuals who had access to books who had begun to question. The name given to these schools of thought was heresy. Gregory saw the fight against heresy as a command from God, and one of his most effective steps in this direction was the establishment of the Inquisition. The Inquisition would be the event that associated Pope Gregory IX's name with one of the harshest phases in history. These courts would judge not only thoughts but also nature, and everything within nature would now be measured by intent. The direction from which the wind blew, what a woman wore, what a child dreamed at night, or even an animal's behavior could be questioned and even cursed. This period was an era of interpreting God's wrath through the signs of nature. It was in this very climate that a rumor reaching Pope Gregory IX would change the course of history. A cleric living in Germany, known as a heretic named Conrad of Marburg, wrote a mysterious and chilling letter to the Pope. This letter claimed that some people worshiped the devil, held nocturnal rites, and in these rites, swore allegiance to the devil by kissing black cats. Although this letter seemed like mere gossip in the hazy atmosphere of the Middle Ages, it was enough for Gregory, because he took spiritual threats seriously. Even an ordinary animal like a cat could be associated with the devil. Because for a pope, suspecting everything dark was not suspicion but a responsibility. Gregory not only read this letter but turned it into an edict. The document he called Vox in Rama, a voice in Rama, declared black cats to be the embodiment of the devil. Now, the presence of a black cat was not just an animal but a spiritual danger. This decision targeted not only cats but also the subconscious of the people. Suddenly, in every village, every town, every household, a fear of black cats began. Mothers warned their children. Men stoned cats they saw around their houses. Women avoided neighbors who lived with cats. And all this had started with the signature of a man at a table in the Vatican. Pope Gregory IX's personality had compelled him to make this decision. He was the Pope of order. He found the way to silence chaos in destroying every threat in God's name. And in that era, even nature was not considered outside God's absolute dominion. Black cats were no longer just animals, but the very shadow of the devil on earth. Because Gregory had decreed it. Today, this decision may seem strange or comical, but in the Middle Ages, a papal decree was not just an opinion, it was the difference between life and death. The war declared on black cats was a result of this understanding. Gregory IX's decree was not just words. It was the formalization of a kind of fear, and thus began one of history's most unjust wars. A man spoke in God's name, and thousands of innocent creatures perished in the echo of that voice. There are moments in history when a single piece of parchment costs thousands of lives. A single signature turns into a fear carried from generation to generation, and a single edict remains like a black stain on the mind of not just an era, but an entire civilization. One of those moments was inscribed into the Vatican archives by the trembling hands of scribes. The year was 1233. It was a spring day when the chill had not yet fully lifted. Pope Gregory IX affixed his seal to one of history's most unusual documents. Its name, Vox in Rama, a voice in Rama. But this voice was not a call to salvation. It was the whisper of an annihilation. Its content was neither a peace offer nor a manifesto of faith. This document was a spiritual war declared against black cats, and particularly against everything they symbolized. The genesis of Vox in Rama began, in fact, with a denunciation. A priest named Conrad von Marburg, accused of heresy but taken seriously by the Pope, reported while traveling through the depths of Germany about the existence of some strange communities. These communities gathered at night, held rites, and claimed to worship the devil. One of the central elements of these rites was a frightening symbol, a black cat. According to his letter, these cats were first blessed, then kissed, sometimes even embraced while oaths of allegiance were sworn, and everything was done in the devil's honor. This narrative appealed more to fear than to logic. But for Gregory, logic was not what mattered, order was. And in this order, heresy was the greatest threat. Before the Church's authority was shaken, the weapon of fear had to be deployed. Thus, the Pope made a decision. He concluded that these strange rites were not only satanic but also contrary to nature and order. Black cats were no longer merely animals. They were the symbol of the devil. The bull was far harsher than a typical papal document. It was not just about faith, it was a direct order. Sent to the bishoprics in Germany, particularly to authorities around Mainz and Hildesheim, this bull commanded action against the devil worshippers and the animals they used in their rites. The document mentioned cats directly, asserting that they were the embodiment of the devil. For the first time in history, an animal was being cursed in such an institutionalized manner. But the edict did not merely point to a target. It also implied how this target was to be cleansed. The storming of the heretics' homes, the dispersal of their ritual grounds, the rounding up and eradication of black cats, this was not hidden between the lines. It was explicit. Because fear was no longer being hidden, it was being put on display, and Vox and Rama disseminated it. It reached not only the episcopal palaces but also the minds of the people. Church officials read the edict in their sermons. Priests even claimed that black cats stole souls at night and haunted children's sleep. The edict functioned not only as a text but also as a chain of rumors. One person read it, 10 people recounted it, 100 people feared it. If a black cat was seen prowling on a roof one day, a house could be burned down the next morning. Or if a sick child rambled in their sleep, the blame could be cast upon a neighbor's cat. Because now, everyone harbored a fear within them. This fear grew not in the lines of the edict, but in the hearts of the people, and nothing spreads faster than fear. Over time, Vox and Rama transformed into a hatred that encompassed not only black cats, but all cats. Because to the people, there was no difference between black and gray. Who could know what color the devil would wear? Therefore, throughout the Middle Ages, in many regions of Europe, cats were either completely eradicated or branded as entities to be shunned. This situation also had long-term effects. The rat population increased rapidly, especially during the period of the Black Death, which is the name of another catastrophe. The absence of cats further weakened Europe's fragile structure. But at the time, no one realized this. Because everyone believed they were waging a war in God's name. Yet, this was not a war. It was a cultural massacre, needed from ignorance, nurtured by fear, and triggered by a single signature. And this massacre demonized an animal species to an extent rarely seen in history. The edict still resides in the Vatican archives. Yellowed, but enduring. A text of a few paragraphs, yet it left behind centuries of pain. Because words may be forgotten, but their effects can linger for centuries. And so, this process initiated by the Pope's signature would turn into one of history's most absurd, yet bloodiest, campaigns. Europe's stone streets were still damp. The moss on the walls hung green, like the memory of time, and the wind carried the echo of church bells to the most distant villages. But the sound of the bells now symbolized not only prayer times, but also a dark summons. Pope Gregory IX edict, Vox and Rama, had formalized the hatred towards cats. However, behind this edict lay not just Conrad von Marburg's letter or an uneasy feeling towards black cats. This document was the product of a discourse of fear, woven stitch by stitch over centuries, the narratives of the devil and the heretic. Everything had started much earlier. The idea of the devil was one of the most powerful weapons in Christian theology. But the devil was not just an unseen entity. It often lived by taking human form, breathing with them, and speaking through them. The devil could manifest in an illness, a nightmare, a scream, or an animal. And this understanding had transformed into a belief system that shaped life in every corner of Europe. Particularly, any unusual behavior was attributed to the devil. It was in this atmosphere that heretics emerged, meaning anyone who thought, spoke, or lived outside the faith imposed by the church as the one and only truth. They were called heretics. But this heresy was not considered a mere difference of thought. It was seen as a direct rebellion against God. Therefore, a heretic was not just a dissenter but also an enemy in league with the devil. The wars waged against the Cathars in the Languedoc region of southern France towards the end of the 12th century demonstrated how deep this fear ran. For the Cathars, the world was a battlefield between good and evil. They believed the material world was satanic. This alone was enough. Because saying the world belonged to the devil meant questioning the order over which the church ruled. Thus, a bloody crusade was launched against the Cathars. With the Pope's approval, thousands of people were slaughtered. But it wasn't only people who were killed. Ideas were also being buried. These wars reinforced the understanding that a heretic equaled collaboration with the devil. The Church now defined heretics not merely as wrong thinkers, but as agents of supernatural evil. If a bird sang near a heretic, it was considered a sign. If someone fell ill, they were thought to be a witch. Heresy was a metaphysical crime. It couldn't be seen with the eyes, but its signs were everywhere. And one of the primary signs was cats. Black cats, in particular, were frequently seen in the homes of heretics. Because these people lived more in harmony with nature and were closer to animals. Many heretic groups rejected traditional Catholic hierarchies, advocating that one could reach God directly through prayer, nonviolence, and a simple life. In this context, a heretic woman's silence, the bond she formed with her cat, her interest in herbs, all of it was found strange. This strangeness turned into a trace of the devil. The church was quick to make this connection. Heretic women kissed cats in their nocturnal rites. Black cats were at the center of the rituals. Cats stood next to statues symbolizing the devil during ceremonies. These claims formed the very basis of the letter Conrad von Marburg sent to the Pope. In truth, the letter was not just an individual obsession. It was the formalization of a fear nurtured for centuries. The symbols of the devil changed over the years. Initially associated with the serpent, then with the goat's horns, later with the owl. But in the medieval psyche, the form that frightened them the most was embodied in an ordinary animal, the black cat. Because this creature neither speaks nor obeys commands. Because this creature had been considered sacred in ancient Egypt and had been seen as the protector of the home in some pagan communities. This past was incompatible with Christianity's monotheistic system. The symbol of the past was branded as the enemy of the future. When the discourses of heresy and the devil merged, Pope Gregory IX's Vox in Rama edict became almost inevitable. This edict did not only target the rites defined as satanic. It also officially cursed the black cat, which stood at the symbolic center of these rites. Because this creature represented both nature and alternative thought. For the Church, the greatest danger was the union of the freedom of nature and the freedom of thought. Vox in Rama was the natural result of anti-devil and anti-heretic policies. But perhaps, unnoticed, it initiated a process in which an animal became one of the most excluded and misunderstood in history. When heretic women were burned, their cats were also destroyed alongside them. Because the devil had seeped not only into their souls but also into their fur. Ultimately, these narratives laid the foundation not only for the fears of an era but also for prejudices that extend to the present day. If seeing a black cat is still considered bad luck, this notion is not just a superstition. It is a dirty reflection of history. And so it was. The roots of the edict stretched back into the past, to the fear of the devil and humanity's hatred for the other. To demonize an animal, all that was needed was a search for an enemy, and the church had already declared that enemy. Two eyes gleaming on the roof of a stone hut in the dead of night. A four-legged shadow walking silently as if born from the night itself. A black silhouette that suddenly appears before you on utterly silent streets, then swiftly vanishes. For a medieval person, this scene was not just the sight of an animal. It was like a wink from hell. Because the people did not see the night merely as darkness. The night was the time when the devil held sway, and any creature that could move freely during this time was suspect. Black cats were born right into this suspicion. Their eyes reflect light. They can see in the night, move silently in the dark. It existed with a freedom that humans could not comprehend. And these abilities were considered supernatural by the mentality of that era. Because medieval people classified every unexplained aspect of nature as either sacred or cursed. Cats were neither as docile as sheep nor as loyal as dogs. They were independent. This made them incomprehensible. And what was incomprehensible was to be feared. The association of black cats with the devil was not only about their physical appearance. Their historical past also strengthened this perception. Cats, which were considered sacred in ancient Egypt and associated with goddesses in some pagan cults, were suspicious in the eyes of Christianity. Because Christianity had branded all pre-existing beliefs as paganism. Therefore, every symbol associated with the old gods began to be seen as close to the devil. Black cats, once the sacred beings of the past, became the curse of the Middle Ages. However, what truly changed the fate of black cats was not folk legends, but church sermons. Many priests began describing cats from their pulpits as the devil's watchmen on earth. According to them, the devil entered the bodies of cats during nocturnal rites. He watched people through their eyes, touched human souls with their paws. Some texts narrated that the devil appeared to heretics by taking the form of a black cat and participated in their rituals. The bond between women and cats, in particular, further fueled this perception. Because many women lived with their cats, fed them, talked to them, and gave them names. These women were often alone or ostracized from society, and the formula lonely woman equals witch, which equals devil, devil equals black cat had been established in the mind of society. Cats were no longer just animals. They were considered the helpers of witches, meaning the servants of the devil. This understanding was eventually carved into the collective memory. A black cat crossing in front of a door was considered bad luck. If a black cat was seen in a field, it was believed the crops would wither. In some villages, children were encouraged to stone cats. Women who were close to their cats were accused of making pacts with the devil. Because people had heard that cats roamed the homes of heretics who held rites at night, and in the Middle Ages, hearsay preceded observation. This discourse was supported even in the Church's official documents. As explained in previous sections, Pope Gregory's Vox and Rama edict turned this fear into law. Black cats were not only associated with the devil, they were legally declared dangerous. And this decision legitimized a culture of lynching against cats. In many parts of Europe, cats were burned, buried alive, and tortured. They were all victims of a belief. But this belief is not a random superstition. It is the product of a systematic narrative. The black cat, as a representation of the devil, was not just a symbol. It was a symbol of the different, the free, the feminine, and the close to nature. That is why it was punished. Because the black cat was contrary to the monotonous order represented by the church. It was the free spirit of the night. And this made it dangerous. Interestingly, this hatred towards black cats did not remain solely at the level of belief. They were also punished socially. People who kept a black cat in their home could not find work, could not marry off their daughters, and could not shop in the market. Owning a black cat became a stigma. Thus, a distance based on fear developed between cats and people, and this distance was passed down through generations. The ironic result of this situation was that with the destruction of cats, Europe was struck by the plague. Because as cats decreased, rats multiplied, and rats were the primary carriers of the plague. When the cats seen as devils were destroyed, the real hell arrived on the backs of rats. But this truth would only be understood years later. For the people of that time, one thing was important: to see a black shadow walking in the darkness. If that shadow was a black cat, to immediately throw a stone. Because it wasn't just an animal. It was a being defying God. And so it was born. The process of black cats being perceived as devils. A narrative fed by fear, shaped by ignorance, transformed into a propaganda tool in the hands of power. And if today, when a black cat crosses our path, a strange unease settles within us, this is not just a superstition, it is a reflection of a collective trauma. There was a hut in Europe. Its door was old. Its walls were covered in moss. And inside, there was silence. This was not the silence of fear, but the silence of wisdom. An old woman stirred the cauldron on the hearth, and her cat by the window watched her, making purring sounds. The woman's eyes were tired but peaceful. The cat's eyes were like the night, silent and bright. Yet for the villagers outside, this scene was not an innocent life, but a curse itself. Because the people called this woman a witch, and the animal beside her the devil's watchman. Thus, the combination of a human's solitude and a cat's loyalty was considered a sign of the road to hell. Throughout the Middle Ages, the concept of the witch was a figure both feared and needed. Witches were often lonely women, widows, unmarried elderly women, the destitute. Those who lived close to nature, used plant knowledge, delivered babies, healed. However, knowledge in that era was a privilege that was supposed to be in the hands of men and the church. A woman understanding or controlling nature threatened the spiritual structure of the order, and this threat began to take shape alongside black cats. The connection between cats and witches actually arose from two unwanted figures meeting in the same solitude. The woman was lonely because she was ostracized from society. The cat was lonely because it was not domesticated. The presence of these two in the same house created a satanic partnership in the minds of the people. Because both the woman and the cat loved the night. They were silent. They spoke with their eyes. They did not take orders. And most dangerously, they were free. For the church, freedom was uncontrollable. And everything uncontrollable was a potential threat. Therefore, cats began to be mentioned in many sermons. Cats were defined as spirits serving witches. According to some theologians, the devil communicated more easily with animals than with humans. Because animals, being innocent, could be more easily directed, and especially cats, because they were mystical. In church documents, cats are explicitly mentioned in some witch trials. One reads, "The accused entered the forest with her cat at midnight and performed a rite." Another states, "A black cat was left at the frog's door accompanied by magical words." These narratives gradually became more widespread among the people. A cat's gaze was no longer just a gaze. It was considered the beginning of a curse, especially making eye contact. People believed that if a witch looked into your eyes together with her cat, she would begin to suck out your soul. These fears legitimized the torture inflicted upon cats. Every cat living with a woman suspected of being a witch was either tied up or burned. Because according to belief, if the woman was truly a witch, the cat would not die, because then she would have transferred her soul into the cat's body. In some regions, there were even superstitions like if the cat is reborn, the woman is definitely a witch. Can you imagine? The resurrection of an animal causing a woman to be burned. The identification of cats with witches was fueled not only by fear but also by folklore. In folk tales told in many European villages, old women turned into black cats at night. They would leave their homes, perform satanic rites in the forest, and turn back into humans before morning. While such tales might seem entertaining when told to children, they were actually carriers of the great fears that shaped society. They were the seeds of a hatred implanted in minds at an early age. Furthermore, black cats were stigmatized through art by being depicted alongside witches. In engravings, murals, and manuscripts, a woman wearing a witch's hat invariably had a black cat on her shoulder. This visual language became more effective over time, because even if the people were illiterate, they could see and understand these drawings. The black cat was no longer just a physical entity. It had become the official symbol of evil. Throughout this entire process, cats were seen not only as evidence of witchcraft but also as a means of witchcraft. If a woman had a cat, she was considered capable of performing magic. Because that cat brought the devil's message at night, protected the objects used during sorcery, and sometimes even spoke in a spiritual manner. These narratives became so widespread that cats began to appear as accomplices in many court records, and thus the cursing of an animal by identifying it with a belief was completed. Now, the purr of a black cat was considered the beginning of a curse. The cat's fur, claws, voice, all became objects of fear. Yet cats were only silent. Yet women were only lonely. But in that era, even solitude was a crime. Throughout history, no animal had been burned alongside a woman so much. Not the dog, not the bird, nor any other creature. Only the cat. Because only it was the woman's mirror. And both the woman and the cat remained misunderstood in a male-dominated world. If today we still feel a shiver inside when we see a black cat and an old woman together, this is not just an old tale. It is the remnant of a fear that still lives within us. The sound of bells echoing through Europe's muddy streets announced the start of another sermon. That morning, the peasants coming to the market mass would hear not God's mercy, but his wrath. When the priest's voice rose, the church was like a dim dungeon. Words hit the stone walls and echoed again and again. The devil roams in the darkness. The devil disguises himself as a cat. The way to rid oneself of the devil is to rid oneself of his agents. These words were not an expression of faith. They were an order. From that day on, the end of black cats had begun. The hatred towards cats, which had been slowly shaping for years, had now lost its boundaries. A much more organized, much more systematic process of destruction was beginning, far beyond the sporadic burning, stoning, or burying alive of cats. The church had now declared war not only on souls but also on bodies, and the first target was a four-legged, furry, innocent being. Pope Gregory's edict was as hostile to cats as it was to heretics and devil worship, especially black cats. But in the eyes of the people, this color distinction also became meaningless over time, because the form of darkness changed. Black, gray, spotted, it didn't matter. If a cat appeared at night, if its gaze was deep, if it was silent, that was enough. The devil assumed different forms. Therefore, every cat was suspicious, and this suspicion spread like famine, like an epidemic. The cat massacres began first in small villages. A few children stoned the first cat, calling it a witch's cat. Then the village priest praised this behavior. Then another cat was brought. It was tied to a stake. Holy water was sprinkled on it, and prayers were said for it to be cleansed. Then it was burned. After a while, these rituals turned into Sunday rites. People gathered in church courtyards, cats were declared objects of sin, and executed in front of the crowd. Children applauded, women prayed in fear, men watched without even blinking. Because this was now considered a form of worship. Killing a cat was serving God. At least, that's how it was told. But this hatred was not limited to individual actions. Over time, it became mass destruction. In some regions, municipalities and similar local authorities organized cat cleansing days. Cats were collected from the people, taken to designated areas, and burned. Purification cages made of wood were built. Cats were stuffed inside. Then the cage was set on fire. Some of these scenes were even recorded in monastery diaries. A priest wrote, "This morning, 70 cats were burned to bring God's light. The people found peace." Had the people found peace? Perhaps for a moment. But this peace was an intoxication born of fear. Because they feared not the cats, but the unknown, and destroying the unknown provided a sense of security. With every cat burned, humanity lost a little more of its mind, surrendering a little more to its primitive emotions. The most horrific massacres took place during holidays. Especially on certain religious feast days, cats were symbolically declared the devil and destroyed in front of the community. The cat-throwing festivals in France, the cat cart parades in Germany, and the executions by hanging from rafters in some Spanish towns belonged to this period. Cats were placed in baskets while still alive and thrown from high places, killed slowly. This was not just a death. It was a spectacle. In some places, churches themselves organized these ceremonies. Because these ceremonies diverted the people's attention from other things. Poverty, hunger, injustice, all were forgotten. When a cat was tied up and set on fire, people felt powerful. It was an illusion of superiority in the face of helplessness. The violence inflicted on an innocent animal was actually a symbol of the church's absolute control over the people. And then the most tragic part happened. Cats were wiped out from the towns. Now rats frolicked in the streets. Crops in the fields were gnawed. Grain stores were emptied. Diseases spread. But people interpreted this situation as the price of a new sin. No one could perceive the consequences of the absence of cats. To them, God was angry. That's why there was famine. But the truth lay elsewhere. By demonizing cats, humanity had actually tried to suppress its own dark side. But this suppression ultimately gave birth to a greater catastrophe. Like the plague, like death, like chaos. As time passed, the streets became quieter, filthier, and more uneasy. At first, no one could fully understand the reason. Church bells continued to ring. Priests kept giving sermons on sin. People prayed and repented. Yet, they couldn't rid themselves of that strange feeling of unease growing inside them. However, a truth was right before everyone's eyes, a truth no one dared to voice. The cats were gone. The agile silhouettes roaming the streets had disappeared. The faint scratching sounds from chimneys were no longer heard. Someone looking out the window at midnight would no longer encounter a small dark shape walking along the fence. There were no cats in the fields, in the barns, in the pantries, or in the village ovens. No black ones, no yellow ones, no kittens. Europe had buried an animal in a wave of total hatred, and the result was silence. But this silence was not a harbinger of peace, but of an approaching catastrophe. The cat population had dwindled terrifyingly in just a few years. There were very few records documenting this. But the echo of this absence could be heard in the folk tales of the time, peasant complaints, and monastery notes. In Germany, some monastery diaries wrote, "We are disturbed by the increase in the number of rats." In England, records of some villages had notes like, "The wheat sacks are empty. We cannot cope with the creatures gnawing the grains." But these were still not associated with the absence of cats, because that connection had already been severed in their minds. Cats were the devil's messengers. Their absence was thought to be a blessing. However, nature abhors a vacuum. Where there were no cats, rats multiplied. At first, people thought this was temporary, but soon swarms of rats began to enter homes, grain stores, and even churches, because their natural predators were gone. In those years, famines began to appear in Europe. But one of the invisible reasons behind this famine was this: the rat plague. Without cats, the multiplication of rats was not just a possibility, but an inevitable balance. But no one wanted to see it. Why had the cat population decreased so much? Because a culture of hatred had been legitimized by a single edict. Because, along with the witch hunts, the cats that were their helpers had also been targeted. Because children were advised to throw stones when they saw cats. Because society had celebrated the destruction of an animal as a religious victory. And this perception was not limited to black cats. Over time, it spread to all types. In some cities, cats were almost on the verge of extinction. In some neighborhoods of Paris, not a single cat remained. The streets of Rome had turned into a labyrinth where only rats scurried at night. Cats were no longer seen in London's markets. In some regions, even newborn kittens were killed, destroyed so that satanic blood would not multiply. This was a kind of animal genocide. A genocide carried out slowly, silently, and systematically. The dramatic drop in the cat population was also an indicator of the fear in the people's subconscious. Because destruction begins not when fear diminishes, but when it grows. The more people were filled with hatred towards cats, the more they feared them. And that fear was not directly a religious fear. It was a feeling towards the unknown, the uncontrolled, the free. Because the cat was a creature that never domesticated. You couldn't own it. You could only be its friend. It demanded respect more than loyalty. This made it different from other animals. And being different was a crime in the dark structure of the Middle Ages. The natural balance was disrupted with the absence of cats. But people were focused only on their sins, not on this balance. In those years, child deaths increased in many parts of Europe. Epidemic diseases appeared. But people associated these deaths more with sin than with rats. They prayed more. They repented more. They killed more cats. But in their consciousness, they were actually paving the way for their own disaster. The decline in the cat population was not just a biological destruction, but a symbolic one. Because the absence of those animals represented one of the deepest collective regrets in human history. And the real pain was that this absence was celebrated as an achievement at the time. Today, Seeing a cat roaming freely in the streets of a European city, just thinking about what its ancestors went through can be chilling. But this history must not be forgotten, because every living being silently destroyed returns one day with a roar, and that roar would come with history's greatest epidemic. The smell of the earth had changed. Rustling had begun in the stone crevices beneath the houses. At first, no one noticed, because an approaching catastrophe is always understood by silence. But this change, felt simultaneously in Europe's villages, towns, and cities, was now too great to be hidden. The rustling from kitchens at midnight, the holes chewed in sacks by morning, the shadows suddenly darting in barns. In the absence of cats, the stage was now theirs, rats and mice. There was a nature that had lived in balance for centuries. Cats were the silent guardians protecting the fields, homes, churches, and barns from rat infestations. But fear disrupted this balance. Cats were declared devils. They were burned, stoned, forgotten, and in their absence, nature filled its own void with its own methods. Thus, Europe unwittingly opened its doors to rats. This was not just an increase. It was literally an explosion. Especially from the mid-13th century onwards, the rat population in many parts of Europe began to spiral out of control. Cities had grown, people had crowded, waste was scattered in the streets. This environment was a paradise for rats. But before, they wouldn't have dared to enter such paradises. Because cats were there. Cats were the guardians silently maintaining this balance. A silhouette appearing on a rooftop at night was enough to force rat colonies to relocate. But now, there was no threat left. Rats began to descend into the streets. First a few, then dozens, hundreds. The streets teemed at night. People woke up in the morning to find gnawed fruits in their homes, hole-ridden sacks, and even small bite marks on the edges of cradles. This was not just a pest infestation. It was nature's revenge. The absence of cats meant not just the lack of one species, but the collapse of the entire system. Because the cats were gone. They had been declared devils. But now the devil was returning in another form. It was furry, gray, arriving with its mate, with its swarm. The situation was worse in the countryside. Fields were being invaded by rats. Seeds were gnawed, roots damaged. Wheat stalks were destroyed. Every season without a harvest was interpreted in the people's minds as a new punishment from God. But no one mentioned the absence of cats, because even thinking about it was considered blasphemy. Some monastery records from this period contain lines referring to the shadows brushing against our feet while praying at night. These are the shadows of rats. Some monks wrapped shelves in shroud-like covers to protect their books in churches, but could not block out the gnawing sounds of rats. Now even holy books were being gnawed. Even the words of God were left unprotected in the absence of cats. The situation in the cities was even more dramatic. Major cities had no sewer systems. Garbage, waste, food scraps, everything was in the streets, and this was an endless feast for rats. The proliferation of rats was not just a physical increase. It was also a harbinger of societal collapse. Because the microorganisms they carried brought diseases. First itches, then fevers, followed by mass deaths. But that is the subject of another catastrophe. The cries of children in the streets began to be heard more frequently. Because the rats were no longer afraid. Not even of people. The cats were gone. The streets were silent, but that silence was pierced by the sound of gnawing. Over the years, the people grew accustomed to this situation without realizing it. They had forgotten how important cats were. The absence of cats had become the norm. New generations were born into a world full of rats, and they didn't even know of the existence of animals that once silently fought these creatures. For them, it was normal to see a rat in their home, whereas their ancestors' generation couldn't spend their childhood without seeing a cat. Such a profound change was not only ecological but also a cultural transformation. The absence of cats even seeped into folk tales. Stories like the child fighting rats at night, or the peasant with a rat falling on his head became new pieces of folklore. But these stories turned into amusing masks covering the truth. The truth was this: Europe had destroyed nature's guardians of balance with its own hands. And the rats had not missed this opportunity. This explosion would later pave the way for one of history's greatest catastrophes, the plague epidemic. But people were still cursing cats. Because seeing a rat was a habit, but seeing a cat was still frightening. People were attached to their fears, and now those fears were transforming on the backs of rats. And so, the cats fell silent. But the world was about to awaken in a much noisier way. The air was heavy. At night, not even the wind blew. People talked less in the streets, avoiding eye contact. Church bells now rang not only on holy days but also for deaths. And although no one had yet realized it, there was a growing darkness in every street, every stone, every breath of Europe. It would later be called the Black Death. But at first, it was a silent hum. A hum that started with the footsteps of rats in stone crevices, slowly climbing onto human bodies, bringing death itself. Everything began after the dramatic decrease in the cat population. The cats, once the invisible guardians of the streets, had been sacrificed to religion. They had been killed, destroyed, burned, called the devil's animal. The void they left behind opened a giant rift not only in the streets, but also in the balance of nature. The cats were gone, and in their absence, the rats had multiplied. Those rats didn't just gnaw on crops. They carried death. But that death would first come as lightly as dust, then descend like a nightmare. The Great Plague had come from Asia. It had advanced from distant ports, caravan routes, through the veins of trade. But the most important vehicle carrying it was the entity mankind most underestimated, the black rat and the fleas on its back. These tiny carriers transported a bacterium called Yersinia pestis to humans, transmitting it from one town to another, from one family to the next, from a child to an elder. But no one knew of this bacterium. They only saw the results. Fever, vomiting, blackened limbs, pus-filled swellings, and the ensuing death. The first symptoms appeared in Italy's coastal cities. From the mid-14th century onwards, crews disembarking from ships docking in ports were either sick or dead. Among the goods arriving with the ships were not only fabrics, spices, or fruits, but also invisible death. Upon reaching the shore, people fell ill and died within a few days, and this speed brought panic with it. At first, the people believed this was a new wrath from God. Priests blamed sin from their pulpits. Repent, they said, beg, confess. But the deaths did not stop. More and more corpses were carried each day. Burial grounds filled, mass graves began, and in time, people fell into a world where death became commonplace. After a while, the smells began. Because there was no place left to bury the corpses. Families buried people in their own gardens. Churches buried them collectively in fields. In cities, dead bodies were left on street corners. Only a cloth was thrown over them. In these cities without cats, rats roamed around these corpses, bringing more carrier fleas closer to people. Death was not only in the air, but right upon the body itself. Fear was also spreading. In some cities, people stopped going outside. They nailed their doors shut with wooden planks. Some left their children at churches. God forbid. Some, when they fell ill, would shut themselves in a hut and wait to die. But no matter what was done, when death came, it could not be stopped. And the most painful part was that people were growing accustomed to death. The Black Death was not just a disease, it was also creating a spiritual collapse. People were searching for the cause of death. Some blamed the stars. Some blamed witches, some the Jews, some nomadic peoples. But almost no one mentioned the absence of cats, because those animals had been considered representatives of the devil, and now the devil was returning in another form. It was one of history's greatest moments of irony. Cats had been killed to drive out the devil, but the real devil had begun to reign in a world without cats. People had destroyed the ecosystem with their own hands, disrupted its balance, and then began to pay the price for this disruption. The plague was the scream of that balance. The Black Death wiped out 1/3 of Europe. In some regions, half the population died. Streets were left empty. Agriculture stopped, trade collapsed. Kingdoms fell silent. Even kings began to pray. Because death did not distinguish between noble and commoner. Poor or rich, woman or man, all of humanity was wrestling with the same darkness. In some cities, dances of death were organized. People wore skeleton masks and danced in the streets. Because going mad was sometimes salvation. In some villages, people were forced to burn their dead, because there was no time to bury them. Some churches were left without priests, because they had all died. Humanity was learning, perhaps for the first time in its history, what collective helplessness meant. But curiously, when cats slowly began to return, the disease also began to slow down. Was this a miracle? No. It was nature's effort to return to its own rhythm. Cats began to be seen on the streets again. At first, people still thought they were devils. But when a cat caught a rat, gratitude, not fear, was born within them. Some mothers began to bring cats back to their children, because that creature had now become a symbol of life, not death. After the Black Death, people lost a lot. Their families, their neighbors, their faith. But they also learned a great deal, and perhaps one of the most painful lessons was this: to destroy an animal can destroy not only it, but the entire world. A city is a ghost. Its stone streets are covered in mud. A city where carts creak by. The smells of rotten fruit mix in the air in the markets. Garbage piles up like mountains in the back alleys. People walk hurriedly. They shy away from touching each other. Their eyes are tired, their bodies pale. But what truly roams the walls of this city is an invisible army. Rats and fleas. And the death carried on their backs is seeping into houses like an unspoken whisper. When the Great Plague is mentioned, the first things that come to mind are the boils, blackened skin, and sudden deaths on the human body. But death rarely introduces itself directly. Its true face often moves in the shadows. So it was in this epidemic. Death's real carriers were too small to be seen with the eye, but their effects were great enough to bring an entire continent to its knees. Rodents and the fleas living on them. The biological agent of the plague was the bacterium Yersinia pestis. This bacterium was not transmitted directly from human to human. There were living creatures that carried it, and these creatures had infiltrated under every stone in Europe. Black rats, in particular, played the leading role in spreading this bacterium. Black rats lived in the roofs of cities, in barns, in sewers, behind ovens, among sacks of flour. not every person who saw them was afraid. Because at that time, rats were considered merely a nuisance. Yet, some of them were carriers of death. The fleas on these rodents formed the truly deadly link. When these fleas bit an infected rat, they could not digest the Yersinia pestis bacteria. The bacteria clung to their stomach walls, forming a blockage. When the flea tried to bite another living creature again, it would vomit due to this blockage, regurgitating the bacteria directly into the bloodstream of the creature it bit. Thus, a flea bite became a lethal injection. And these fleas spread from rats to humans, then to other humans, and even to new rats. Especially in crowded cities, the flea's range of movement was vast. Because people lived together, slept together, traveled together. Siblings sharing the same bed, spouses lying together, relatives eating from the same plate, all became part of the same chain of death. A flea that had bitten a rat in another house a few hours earlier would now latch onto a child's neck, carrying the bacteria under the skin, and the child would lose its life 2 days later. The irony was this: by destroying cats, Europe had given rats and fleas direct passage. The presence of cats was the most natural solution for keeping the rodent population under control. But cats had been destroyed on the grounds that they were linked to the devil. This extinction was the end not only for the cats, but for the balance of all nature. Now the rats were free, and this freedom had turned into a mobility that brought death. The situation in rural areas was somewhat different. Here, even if houses were far apart, rats could reach from the fields to the barns, and from there to the huts. Especially during the periods after the harvest when grains were stored, the number of rats increased, and with them, the fleas spread. When people saw these creatures, they might have felt a little uneasy, but they still hadn't understood what it meant. Because it was easy to blame the invisible. But looking at what was visible was often more difficult. In the cities, the fear was more pronounced. The number of rats roaming the streets was now at a level that could not be ignored. Especially in night markets or flour mills, people had grown accustomed to rats running under their feet. But this habit meant living intimately with death, because each rat carried dozens of fleas on its back. And each flea meant potential death for several people. The plague had descended upon people not only as a disease but as a consequence of ignorance. The mind that had destroyed the cats did not see the rats. Instead of suspecting the rats, it had turned to witches, Jews, nomads, and sin. But the truth was silent. It was small, soft-footed, and when it approached humanity, no one had noticed it was coming. Some sources write that after the plague spread, in some cities, rats were declared the true face of the devil, but this decision was made after it was too late. If the cats had lived, perhaps this decision would never have been made. Perhaps some of the millions who died could have survived. Rats and fleas were the two silent armies of the plague. One was visible but underestimated. The other was invisible but possessed a deadly throne. This duel prepared one of the greatest catastrophes in European history, and the most painful part was that this disaster had been prepared by human hands. What a great delusion it was to think that death would not come in a world without cats. The bells were ringing, but no longer for God, but for the dead. Every morning, another village was buried in silence. Every evening, smoke rose from another town. Even the gravediggers were dying. Prayers were cut short. Priests could find no one to hear confessions. The Black Death was swallowing not only human bodies but the very soul of all Europe. The epidemic did not just advance. It swept through as it moved. As the first wave climbed north from Italy, only a time difference remained between cities. Florence fell silent. Marseille closed. Paris burned. When it reached England, people now knew what they would face, but they still couldn't stop it. Because death did not knock on the door. It had its own key. It came, it entered, and within a few days, it turned the house into a tomb. Europe's population in those years is estimated to have been between 75 and 80 million. But the epidemic erased at least a third of this number, and in some regions, half. Not only people, but households, family names, and lineages disappeared. In some villages, not a single person remained alive. Maps now began to mark not living places, but lost villages. The epidemic did not only kill the body, it also corrupted human relationships. A mother became afraid to touch her child, a husband his wife, a neighbor his neighbor. When people looked at each other, they now carried not love, but suspicion. Because the plague was invisible. A pale face, a deep cough, the heat of a forehead. Any of these could be the beginning of a farewell. And people had begun to witness these farewells by closing their eyes. In large cities, the number of dead increased so much that cemeteries began to be insufficient. Therefore, in some places, mass graves were dug. Large pits were excavated. Dozens of corpses were thrown in on top of each other. There was neither a wooden coffin nor a prayer left at the head. Just lime and soil and oblivion. One of the most devastating effects was on children. Children born and growing up in that period saw dead bodies instead of toys. They fell asleep to the sound of bells instead of lullabies. They took their first steps passing by a coffin. This generation was not only reduced in number, it was also spiritually broken. Some historians attribute Europe's subsequent withdrawal into itself, the dark periods in art and philosophy, to the trauma of this generation. Because these people grew up with fear, not hope. Agriculture stopped. Fields could not be sown. Because the farmers had died. Animals were left unattended because their shepherds were gone. Markets were not being set up. Because there was no one left to trade. Bridges, roads, inns, they all existed, but were empty. Medieval Europe entered a period for the first time where humanity doubted itself. Everyone was asking the same question: what did we do wrong? But no one wanted to hear the real answer. Because that answer was the echo of a decision made in the past. Cats were declared devils. The natural balance was disrupted. Rats multiplied. Fleas spread. And the plague came. Humanity tried to control nature with its fears, but nature answered with death. The epidemic was so devastating that the social structure began to change. The people who worked the land had died. This increased the value of land. Surviving peasants began to demand more rights from their lords. Rebellions broke out in some regions. The feudal structure was shaken. Europe's social balance was being reshaped by the trail of a bacterium. Religious beliefs were also shaken. Because even priests were dying. Pilgrims carried the plague, monasteries emptied. Some people thought God had abandoned them. Some prayed more. Some lost all faith. The plague consumed not only the population but also faith. And amidst all this destruction, a silent awareness of nature began to emerge. When people began to see cats again, they began to watch them not with fear, but with respect. Because one thing was understood: the absence of cats was also part of this catastrophe. The silent guardians were gone. Nature, without them, was defenseless. And so was humanity. The Black Death did not only kill millions of people. It fundamentally shook Europe's demography, economy, culture, spirituality, and faith in the future, and the void of that loss was not filled for centuries. History is sometimes written not with a sword, but with a piece of fur, and sometimes the root of a catastrophe begins with an overlooked glance, a disregarded creature, or a burned innocent. When the Black Death is mentioned, the first things that come to mind are the dead, epidemic diseases, quarantines, and piles of graves. But in the background of this terrible picture, there is often another story, silently forgotten, the systematic destruction of cats. It all started with fear. The words rising from the church's pulpits had declared cats to be the devil's watchmen on earth. They were incomprehensible beings, emerging from the night, moving silently in the dark, their eyes reflecting light. And for the people of that time, everything incomprehensible was either sacred or cursed. The church had long decided which one to choose. Cats were cursed. With the edict issued by the Pope, the struggle against cats turned into not a spiritual, but a physical war. All cats, but especially black cats, became targets. They were burned, stoned, drowned. All across Europe, especially in town squares, cats were declared the embodiment of the devil and executed. And this brutality was not just accepted by the masses. It was encouraged, applauded, blessed. But this extermination caused a silent rupture in nature's system. As cats disappeared, rats multiplied. In house basements, fields, grain stores, and back rooms of bakeries, rats began to move in hordes. This was not just a cleanliness problem. It was the herald of death. Because the rats were not alone. On their backs was another enemy, invisible to the naked eye, fleas. And those fleas carried the Yersinia pestis bacterium, the plague. Science would clearly establish this connection centuries later. But the people of that time could not make this cause and effect connection. Why the cats disappeared, why the rats increased, why people then started dying, these seemed unrelated, coincidental. Yet, these events were links in the same chain. The mass killing of cats was an ecological chain reaction that directly accelerated the spread of the plague. The increase in rats didn't just cause crop loss or make daily life difficult. It also increased the number of fleas, which were the carriers of the plague bacterium. Because in nature, every species is in balance with another. Cats keep rats under control. When rats decrease, fleas also decrease. But when cats were destroyed, this balance was broken. Rats multiplied, and the fleas on them multiplied. And when those fleas started biting humans, the disaster was already at the door. The irony was that this disruption of balance was done by human hands, for religious reasons. The church had declared war on cats. The people had destroyed cats for the sake of faith. But the result was a response coming not from God's wrath, but from the disruption of nature's balance. And people became the victims of this imbalance they themselves had created. Some historians do not attribute the rapid spread of the plague in Europe solely to population density, hygiene conditions, or trade routes. For them, one of the biggest factors was the absence of cats. Because if there had been enough cats in the cities, the rat population could not have increased so much. If rats had been fewer, the plague bacterium would not have spread so easily. So the plague was not just a disease. It was the echo of humanity's war against nature. This relationship did not remain just a biological cause and effect chain. It also became an indicator of how heavily humanity paid the price for its instinct to destroy what it feared. Cats were incomprehensible. Therefore, they were cursed, destroyed. But their incomprehensibility was actually just in their freedom. Their tendency towards independence rather than loyalty. Their refusal to obey humans, their silent nightly wanderings, these were not threats. They were part of nature's diversity. But the church could never accept what was different. The people acted with this fear, and this fear paved the way for the death of millions. During the epidemic, in some cities, as cats began to be seen again, a decrease in plague cases was observed. This, over time, led some societies to value cats again. But it was already too late. The millions of cats destroyed in those years were not just animals. They were pieces of natural immunity. Even today, there are people who change their path or consider it unlucky when they see a black cat. These beliefs are not just superstitions. They show how fear has become hereditary throughout history, how it has been passed down from generation to generation. But black cats are not just animals. They are a symbol of a great mistake by humanity. The plague was the echo of that mistake, and that echo did not fade from ears for centuries. Time is not the cure for every wound. Some wounds do not scab over. Some silences are like screams. Even after the years of the plague, which had become Europe's black stain, had passed, the shadows it left behind had seeped into the minds of societies. Prayers had been said, sacrifices made, cities rebuilt. But one question continued to echo in the corridors of the church: did we invite death? In medieval Europe, the church determined not only the salvation of souls but also the definition of right and wrong. However, faced with the magnitude of the catastrophe that ended the process, beginning with the destruction of hundreds of thousands of cats, it was forced to question itself for the first time. Because the justice of the prayer, though delayed, had been harsh. And people now feared not only the devil but also the orders they had received. For several generations after the plague years, the church preferred not to address the cat issue openly, because silence was sometimes less shameful than regret. But history, as always, is stubborn, and over time, sentences implying the mistake regarding cats began to appear in the secret diaries kept by some monks in monasteries. The notes of priests who wrote that eyes glowing in the dark should not be cursed were the first whispers of this regret. In the following centuries, especially with the Renaissance, as nature was rediscovered, people began to examine not only scientific realities but also the mistakes of the past. In this period, some naturalists and doctors published texts explaining how cats controlled the rat population. These works attracted the attention not only of the public but also of some church circles. Because there was now an obvious truth. Cats were not the enemy. They were actually the saviors. In some local churches, sermons began to be given stating that what was done to cats was a sin. These sermons were whispered not loudly, but with embarrassment. But even this was a harbinger of great change. Although some clergy did not directly admit past mistakes, they began to argue that there is wisdom in everything God created, advocating that nature as a whole is sacred. This thought was adopted more quickly, especially in rural churches, because the village people were closer to nature. They lived intertwined with cats, fields, and rats. For them, there was no longer a black cat, but a sacred cat. Interesting traditions emerged in some regions. For example, in some villages in Spain, one day a year was declared Cat Day, and milk began to be distributed to cats in the village square. This was not an official confession, but the shaped form of the collective conscience. At the same time, a few medieval frescoes carved on church walls were later secretly repainted. The cats once depicted being crushed underfoot were replaced by a cat resting peacefully in a child's lap. History was not being rewritten, but its shadow was being illuminated a little. Interestingly, this regret found a place not only in religious circles but also in literature. In some poems written in the 17th and 18th centuries, cats were praised while human cruelty was criticized. One poet wrote, "They blended into the night. We were left in the darkness." Of course, not every structure is like stone. There were those within the church who resisted this change. Some conservative clergy, arguing that the decisions regarding cats were a test from God, felt no regret. For them, the cause of the disaster was the sinful people, not the animals. But this view found less and less echo over time, because the people now wanted to listen not only to God's voice but also to the voice of reason. One of the most striking changes was that some monasteries began to adopt cats. Cats were no longer the servants of the devil, but the silent guardians of monasteries. While they chased rats in the library at night, one monk would pray, another would write. The cats, once destroyed by flames centuries ago, now roamed peacefully within holy places. As time progressed, the regret became more visible. Some priests began to directly say this sentence in their sermons: "He who scorns nature denies the Creator." This discourse became a symbol of the Church's reconciliation with nature. Because everyone now understood this, there was a balance, and disrupting this balance would bring not only God's wrath but also nature's. The Church never officially said, "The cat massacre was a mistake." History rarely sees such confessions, but behavior changed, thought changed, and the regret suppressed for generations was silently accepted over time. Perhaps that was enough. Because sometimes the most powerful apology is given not with words, but with changed actions. Today, in many of Europe's cathedrals, you can see a cat silently roaming in the shadow of the stone walls. They cause no disturbance, nor are they shooed away. They are now where they belong, in the place where humans have accepted them again, and they, in turn, trust humans. And perhaps this is the symbol of a belated but precious peace. The silence that comes after destruction sometimes allows humans to rethink their past. The silence that echoed in Europe's ossified city walls after the plague was such a silence. The voids left by death opened deep pits not only in the streets but also in people's minds. And from these pits, a truth began to slowly rise: cats were not the enemy. Perhaps salvation itself was hidden in those tailed shadows. As post-plague Europe tried to catch its breath, the survivors began to review the mistakes of the past. Science was slowly emerging from the dark shadow of religion. Reason was taking the stage again. Efforts to observe nature, establish cause and effect relationships, and make sense of humanity's interaction with its environment increased. And at the center of these efforts, an idea was silently revolving: the cat. These creatures, which initially roamed the streets unnoticed, nested in ruins, chased rats in barns, began to regain value in the eyes of society. Because people had finally learned how cat populations helped control rat and mouse populations. This simple yet vital truth turned the centuries-old fear and hatred of cats into shame. As the new generation of naturalists began to study animals along with plants, observations about cats multiplied. Especially in rural areas, reports began to emerge that where cats were present, crops suffered less damage, grain stores were less gnawed, and rodent-borne diseases were less frequent. These findings were also important for city dwellers, because anyone tracing the paths of the disease eventually arrived at the absence of cats. The cat was no longer just a pet, it had become a symbol of health and order. Some doctors began keeping cats in hospital gardens. This both kept rats away and was believed to be good for the patient's souls. The presence of cats began to be seen as a kind of protective aura. Artists did not remain indifferent to this change either. Especially during the Renaissance, As old iconography began to break down, cats increasingly found their place in artworks. A cat purring on a child's lap, a gray fur ball napping on a writer's desk, a delicate body sunbathing on a windowsill, all began to represent beauty, function, and a deep awareness. Harmony with nature. Cats were no longer identified with the devil. On the contrary, their role in nature was being sanctified. In some regions, particularly in Northern Europe, folk tales about cats began to be rewritten. Stories of protective cats replaced old fear-mongering tales. Stories of a gray cat saving a house from rats and warning its owner in a dream circulated by word of mouth. In some places, even cat statues were erected. In some cities, welcome cats signs were hung at the entrances. This was not an official confession, but the shaped form of the collective conscience. In some homes, decorations shaped like cat scratches were hung on their doors. These ornaments symbolized that the house was protected from rodents and that the homeowner lived in peace with nature. Doorknockers with cats, embroidered pillows, wall paintings, all silently expressed a generation's confrontation with the past. In some cities, even cat protection laws were enacted. Harming pregnant or nursing cats, in particular, became subject to criminal penalties. These laws went down in history as the first examples of the budding idea of animal rights. Because the cat was no longer just an animal, it was a symbol of a lesson, a transformation, a regret. Over time, attitudes towards cats spread from the aristocracy to the common people, from the city to the village, from the scientist to the child. The meaning of the cat was different for everyone, but a common ground had formed. Cats, once demonized. But now they were being declared the protectors of life. And perhaps the most meaningful word was that in the rediscovery of cats, people began to discover their own nature as well. Because to deny a part of nature is actually to deny one's own naturalness. The return of the cats was a symbol of humanity beginning to understand itself anew. Thus, the meaning of black fur, glowing eyes, and shadows gliding silently at night had changed. Now, when one thought of a cat, it wasn't the devil that came to mind, but balance, protection, and awakening. And this entire silent revolution had begun with a single purr. On Europe's stone streets, on avenues that once bore the traces of death, the traces of life began to reappear. Now stories whispered among people were told, not of grave pits. And at the center of these whispers was a silent but powerful transformation. The cats were returning. These elegant creatures, once unconsciously destroyed during the plague years, began to find a place in every layer of society as people reopened themselves to nature. They first appeared in rural areas. The shadows of gray fur began to roam again in the ruined houses of abandoned villages, in grain stores spared from fire, in forgotten mills, tracking the rats. And this time, people did not stone them or drive them away. On the contrary, they watched, protected, and even called them. The peasants who worked the land were the first to notice the return of the cat population. Seeing that crops were less gnawed and barns less damaged, the peasants had once again understood the importance of cats through their own experience. And this knowledge did not remain just an observation. It became a wisdom passed down through generations. Women began to put food scraps in front of their homes. Old men began to call the cats curled up by the stove the guardian of our house. Children included them in their games. Cats were now more than just a pet. They had become part of the family. This acceptance did not remain only at the individual level. Societies, cities, and even some local authorities began to institutionally acknowledge the importance of cats. In inns along trade routes, cats were declared official rat hunters. In some places, small shelters were built for cats. Popular observations that disease rates were lower in neighborhoods where cats lived elevated them to a kind of public health guardians. As the cat population grew, nature's balance also slowly fell into place. Rat and mouse populations began to be naturally limited thanks to the presence of cats. This situation contributed to increased productivity, especially in agricultural economies. So cats became part of an economic system, not just a household. This increase was also evident in cities, especially in crowded marketplaces, along ports, behind bakeries, and near sewers. The number of cats increased significantly. Cats were like the invisible workers of the city. Every morning before sunrise, they would glide silently through those narrow streets, cleaning up the traces left by the night. Some would jump onto a night fisherman's boat, others would purr along to the morning prayers on monastery walls. Society became so accustomed to this new situation that in some cities, small associations were formed directly concerned with the protection and care of the cat population. Of course, these weren't like today's associations, but the respect shown by the people to the old woman leaving food for cats in the church garden showed that it was now a duty. Harming cats began to be seen as a crime committed not only against nature but also against society. Interestingly, the increase in the cat population was not solely due to human initiative. Nature also had a response to this process. Significant increases in birth rates were observed among cats in areas with high rat concentrations. Female cats began giving birth more frequently than average. This biological response was a reflection of nature's effort to rapidly restore its balance. A system disrupted by human hands was now being repaired through the joint effort of both nature and humanity. During this period, cat festivals were even organized in some cities. Especially during post-harvest celebrations, special awards were given to cats. Poems written for them were read. Cats were no longer just animals. They had become the living symbol of a collective memory. People were trying to atone for a mistake in their own past through cats. The names given to cats during this process were also meaningful. Names like Hope, Protector, Healing, and Miracle, Ascension, showed that cats were now perceived as a healing presence, not a supernatural figure. Owning a cat at home began to carry deep meanings, not just for protection from rats, but also to increase the household's bounty, protect children from the evil eye, and multiply peace. As the cat population grew, the psychological effects of these animals on people were also noticed. It was noted that cats were more often seen with people living alone, becoming a tool for coping with loneliness. So cats had begun to fill not only a physical but also an emotional void. Cats were now a symbol of peace, not war. And so, cats became visible again all over Europe. They now existed not just to survive, but to beautify life. Silent, proud, independent, but equally open to affection. They were the most graceful response to one of humanity's greatest mistakes. Because sometimes all you need to heal is a small heart purring on a windowsill. History is a guide for those who want to learn lessons, not for those who want to forget. The mass killings of cats in Europe's medieval darkness, the ensuing plague disaster, and then the rediscovery of cats. This entire chain of events is a living example of the price humanity pays when it turns its back on nature and knowledge. It is a price paid not only with lives but with conscience, reason, and soul. When the seed of superstition is watered with ignorance, it grows like giant trees, and the shadow of those trees, unfortunately, nurtures not light but fear. To view cats as devils, to ignore the 1,000-year friendship of a black-furred creature, is to declare war not just on an animal, but on reason itself. The hostility towards cats that began with an edict from the Pope was actually a reflection of a much deeper problem. In an era dominated not by thought but by fear, people were prone to destroy what they did not understand. Instead of seeking the devil within humanity, they found it in the eyes of an innocent animal in nature. This was a war not only against cats but against knowledge, intuition, and questioning, and the result was clear. The natural balance was disrupted, cats were destroyed. Rats multiplied, fleas spread, the Black Death came. Humanity reaped the fruit of its own fear with blood and pain. History does not remain silent here, because this chain of events is not a coincidence. It is the embodiment of the law of cause and effect. The lesson to be learned from this period is not just to value cats. It carries a deeper message. When humans interfere with nature, especially when they do so without understanding, without knowledge, merely based on belief or rumor, it is not nature but again humans who pay the price. And this price sometimes leaves marks that cannot be erased for generations. The death of thousands of people from the plague is a tragedy. But the real tragedy is the silence in the face of the simple truth behind it. Just a few centuries ago, people considered a black cat crossing their path at night to be bad luck, yet they lost entire cities of people due to the void created by its absence. When faith and ignorance unite, devastation is inevitable. Throughout history, many similar examples have occurred. Witch hunts, the burning of scientists, microscopes being deemed the devil's work, astronomy being declared a sin. All are examples of humanity acting out of fear of the unknown. But the issue of cats is one of the most concrete and physically destructive of these examples. Because here we are dealing with the direct breaking of an ecological chain. At this point, an internal reckoning is necessary. What superstitions still govern us today? What misinformation are we raising our children with? What fears are causing us to harm nature, animals, and people? The chain that began with cats may still be continuing today. Perhaps in a different form, perhaps by stepping on another creature, another belief, another truth. Another truth history tells us is this: nature forgives but does not forget. The cats came back. Yes, perhaps people learned their lesson. But the losses of that era, the lives that perished, the shattered social structures, the collapsed agriculture, the shaken faiths, were never fully repaired. Every new generation grew up in the shadow of these losses, and every shadow holds a memory of the human mind succumbing to darkness. That is why the saying, "Lessons are not learned from history," is not just laziness, but a great blindness. The cost of superstition is charged not only to the people of that era but also to the people of today. Because if knowledge is not transmitted, ignorance repeats itself. Today, science exists. Yes. But there are still those who fear black cats. There are still those who consider the singing of birds to be a bad omen, those who think breaking a mirror will bring misfortune, those who punish left-handed children. And these carry the traces of the past. Whether we realize it or not, the lesson history gave us through cats is actually very simple. Do not fight nature, do not reject knowledge. Walk the path of reason, not fear. Because in the end, nature always wins. But humans sometimes understand this too late. And perhaps that is why one of the most painful lessons written in history is this: you can declare a cat to be the devil, but you can never calculate the curse its absence will bring. Time has changed. Calendars show different years. The stones in the streets are not as cold as they used to be. Cities are noisier, more crowded. But despite all this change, humanity's view of animals still bears the marks of the past. The cats demonized in the Middle Ages may now be circulating on social media as cute charms. But the underlying emotions, beliefs, and prejudices are not completely erased. Modern society's view of animals is still contradictory, still ambivalent, and still wounded. On one hand, there are those who live with cats and dogs in their homes. Those who treat them not just as pets, but almost like children, celebrating their birthdays, buying them toys, even taking them to psychologists. This understanding shows how close human-animal relationships have become in the modern world. But this closeness does not always stem from a healthy understanding, because often this relationship becomes an effort to fill human emotional voids. A form of ownership emerges, shaped not by the animal's nature and needs, but by human desires. On the other hand, there are hungry, sick, ostracized animals on the streets. Thousands of creatures ignored, stoned, poisoned, or simply removed because they are found bothersome. This duality exposes the most fundamental crack in modern society's approach to animals. A being sanctified on one hand and destroyed on the other. This contradiction is fueled not only at the individual level but also by cultural beliefs. In some societies, cats are considered lucky, while in other regions, there are still those who change their path upon seeing a black cat. Those who believe dogs are dirty live in the same city as those who adore them intensely. Those who see an owl as unlucky look at the same sky as those who consider a stork building a nest a harbinger of bounty. Despite the advancement of modern science and increased education levels, superstitions still find a foothold through animals. The origin of these beliefs mostly lies in historical fears. The fear of the unknown is projected onto the animal. For example, creatures like snakes, insects, and rats are ostracized not only because of the risks they carry but also due to the perception that they are instinctively dangerous. Yet, these creatures play important roles in nature's balance. Human-centric thinking sees other elements of nature either as threats or as servants. Beliefs about animals are shaped within this dual polarity. Alongside this, there are also new superstitions of modern times. Supposedly spiritual interpretations like, "If this cat chose you, you're lucky," or "A dog seeing you in your dream is an omen of death," spread rapidly via social media. Even though we live in the information age, information pollution continues to reproduce the darkness of old eras in new forms. People cling to any symbol that makes them feel good. Cats and dogs get their share of this too. Animals are becoming carriers of both inner peace and mystical messages. However, there is another side to this situation. However much people say they have developed empathy for animals, industrial systems ignore this empathy. In the food industry, millions of animals are killed at birth solely for human taste buds. In laboratory tests, their pain is legitimized in the name of science. In the fashion industry, fur is still used as a status symbol. This chasm between conscientious awareness and systematic interests makes one question the sincerity of beliefs about animals. Still, there are hopeful developments. Animal rights laws are strengthening in many countries. Social sensitivity against animal abuse is increasing. Vegan and vegetarian movements are spreading not just as a dietary choice, but as an ethical stance. Shelters established for animals receive more support thanks to social media. This change could be a sign of a slow but profound mental transformation. Yet, we must not forget, real change begins in the mindset before laws. A cat should be valued not because it is cute, but because it has a right to life. A dog should be respected not because it is loyal, but because it is a sentient being. Taking an animal into your home is not claiming ownership over it, but taking on the responsibility of sharing a common life with it. A society's perspective on animals actually reflects how it views itself. The more empathy we can have, the more humanely we live. The more we can love without judgment, the freer we are. And the more justly we can act, the closer we are to a developed civilization. Perhaps history tried to teach us this lesson through cats. Approach with love, not fear. Try to understand instead of destroy. Do not forget that the silent also have a voice. If the cat that was stoned that day is saving you from loneliness today, perhaps it is not you, but you are waiting for its forgiveness. We often remember history not by its victories, but by its mistakes. The hostility towards cats started by a pope's edict was a mirror showing not only the darkness of the Middle Ages but also how easily humanity can surrender to fear. What was reflected in that mirror was not the cats. It was how we silenced our own reason. The curse attributed to black cats was actually the cursing of knowledge. And nature did not attribute this curse. The plague came, took lives, buried hopes. But then everything slowly started again. The cats returned, humans learned their lesson, or thought they did. Because today, some things are still the same. There are still those who stone animals. Those who act out of fears, those who judge instead of question. But now we have a power. Knowledge. We are no longer in the Middle Ages. We no longer rush out on devil hunts in dark streets. But we still have a choice before us. Either we will repeat the mistakes of the past, or we will learn from them. Every fear is the scream of a suppressed ignorance, and every love is a response thrown at it. Trying to understand a cat is actually trying to understand yourself. Listening to a rabbit, a dog, a mouse, a sparrow is heeding the rhythm of nature. Because nature speaks silently, patiently, and in the end, it is always right. The events in this series were real, but this reality does not belong only to the past. We are taking the same exam today. Every day, on every street, for every living being. So if you were affected by these narratives, don't think you just watched a video. You are on a journey of a lesson, a warning, an awareness, and let this journey not end here. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more content like this, turn on notifications, and share in the comments what you felt. Because sometimes the salvation of a cat begins just by clicking a subscribe button, and perhaps a cat will save the world.